Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Please be seated. A few years ago, after one too many unpleasant encounters, I developed a personal policy. I will not argue or debate with atheists. I didn't always have that policy. In fact, when I was in Lethbridge, I was invited to be part of a public panel discussion about the role of religion in society. And the other presenter was a philosophy professor from the University of Lethbridge who was a known outspoken atheist. And I have to admit, I was really nervous about doing this. I didn't have a doctorate in philosophy. I wasn't an academic. I thought he was going to run right down over me. I worried that he might throw around terms and theories that I hadn't heard of, which would make me look like just another uneducated, anti-intellectual preacher who falls back into superstition instead of confronting the world of reasoned, enlightened debate with cold, hard, fact-driven data. And as I was sitting there, inwardly, I was cursing the person who invited me to sit on the panel. And I was even cursing myself for putting myself in a position where my intellectual and professional integrity would be questioned or compromised. But I wouldn't let that discomfort show. There was lunch before the presentation, and we sat together and we chatted amicably over sandwiches before the discussion. We shared stories about the challenges of being dads. We complained about the Lethbridge drivers. And I figured that this friendliness would continue into the public forum. As the discussion was about to begin, the moderator flipped a coin to see who would present first, as the discussion would kick off with each panelist offering a 10-minute argument as to what they thought the role of religion was in society. I picked heads. The results were tails. I would go second. The philosophy professor got up, went to the podium, and declared, well, we all know that religion has been nothing but a destructive force that has impeded human progress throughout history. Oh, we all know this, do we? And I could feel all the eyes in the room turn and look at me. And I felt my ears just turn red. And he went on to say, it continues today. And then he went off on a rant about the Taliban in Afghanistan, the place of women in Saudi Arabia, the religious right creeping into Canada, the Scopes monkey trials and Christian mistrust of science, the silencing of Galileo, Christian complicity in the Holocaust. He went after the usual targets. And as I sat and listened to him, I listened to him rant, I realized that his beef wasn't religion, it was extremism. And as he wrapped up his presentation, I put my collar on. I wore a clergy collar back then, in those days. And I took my place at the podium, and I looked out. I could feel the tension in the room. There were quite a few people of faith there watching and listening, and the professor's presentation had clearly put them on edge. And those who didn't confess any faith were actually worried that I might have found the professor's presentation rude. Well, I did. He was needlessly hostile and arrogant in his presentation and argument. But people were concerned that I might, in response, inflame the tension with a rant of my own. But on the way up to the podium, I shook the professor's hand and politely thanked him for his presentation. And then I looked out at the crowd, anxious to hear how I would respond to an anti-religion tirade. And all I could think of was, wow, that was quite the presentation. Doing what I do and being dressed the way I'm dressed, I wasn't sure if I should come up here. And that was the best I could think of in the moment. People laughed, including the professor. I think they laughed at my attempt at humor, not because I was funny, but because I clearly wasn't going to go off on a rant myself. But then I talked about the contributions of people of faith, specifically Christians, that have made to human progress and innovation. The establishment of the first universities, the advancement of the scientific method, the creation of hospitals, the formation of orphanages, abolitionist movement of the early evangelicals, the civil rights movement of the Black church, the peace movement of the Anabaptists, the international relief and development work of thousands of church bodies around the world. Then I talked about the smaller encounters, the hospital visits, the caring conversations, the gathering of a community, which is something that's being lost in our world. Yet we still gather. Then I pointed out the consequences of the professor's argument was that he seemed to think that the city, Lethbridge, would be better off if my congregation, Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd, closed its doors. We were a destructive force in the community, apparently. And Lethbridge would be a more vibrant community if Southminster United shut down, or if St. Basil's Roman Catholic Church disappeared. He was saying that the city would be in a much better place without the YMCA, or the food bank, or the women's shelter. I was thinking that the professor's understanding of religion in general and Christianity in particular was built on a caricature, where the most extreme elements determine its identity. Christianity is anti-science? Really? You better tell that to all my parishioners who worked at the science station, or those who were doing research at the U of L in healing brain injuries. Christianity is anti-education? For real? You better mention that to the 60 education professionals in my congregation who taught at all levels from preschool to postdoc. Christianity is rabidly right-wing, advancing an extremist xenophobic agenda. Yeah, of course, there are a few well-known churches and outspoken preachers who confuse a worldly, ultra-conservative political stance with the gospel, but studies show that the vast majority of Christians fall within mainstream political categories and support mainstream political parties. This professor was doing what many atheists do. He was using the extremes to define the whole. And many atheists follow this pattern. And this is why I stopped arguing with them. They usually pick a fight with me, and when they do, they usually demand that I say that I believe in the most childish, literal understanding of the Bible in order to tell me how stupid I'm being for believing in something so childish and so literal. They usually start off with the creation story and demand that I use that story to determine my scientific outlook. And when I say that the creation stories, yes, there's two of them, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 are two different stories written in different times for different reasons by separate authors, and they're not to be read literally, but they're clearly allegories. And when I say that, I usually get one of two responses. Oh, isn't that convenient? You're just trying to defend the indefensible. Yeah, right. Or, so, you're admitting that it's complete nonsense, which of course they don't use the word nonsense, they say something a little more colorful. And then they congratulate themselves for beating the pastor in a theological debate without wanting to hear a response. They've read Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, or Sam Harris, all three of whom have deep flaws in their understanding of religion, and then they also adopt their hostile, arrogant posture. And they often use the same language as religious fundamentalists, saying that their arguments are irrefutable. Their intellectual world is often just as black and white as the religious extremists they rail against. And their moral superiority is usually just as grandiose as those church types they are condemning. This is why I don't debate or argue with atheists anymore. I don't find it productive. But back at my debate in Lethbridge, the professor did bring up an issue which sadly I had to agree with him on. And that is Christianity's historical relationship with the Jewish community. And of course, he himself being Jewish, albeit non-observant, I understood where he was coming from. Jewish-Christians relations have always been tense, right from the beginning. What started off as a family fight ballooned into full-out war, with our Jewish friends taking the brunt of Christian aggression because family fights are usually the nastiest. And as many of you know, Christianity started off as a Jewish renewal movement, and many early Christians identified as Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah that they had been waiting for. And this, of course, put them at odds with other Jews who didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and there were a lot of them. Because for them, Jesus may have been a great teacher, maybe even a prophet, but he was no Messiah, they said. They said, if Jesus is the Messiah, the one we've been crying out for, then why doesn't the world look more redeemed? Why are the hungry still not being fed? Why are wars still being started? Why does injustice still run rampant? Why do nations still rage? Why do people still die? And that division never healed. And it wasn't until the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70, and the temple was destroyed, and Jews scattered all over the known world, that Christianity fully parted ways with Judaism as rabbinic Judaism rose. And it was born as a way of keeping their faith alive in the absence of a temple. And Christianity taking root in other countries beyond Israel's borders, and adopting customs and traditions of those countries, which were distinctly different from those of their native Judaism. And that's when the animosity between Christians and Jews really took hold and led to atrocities as Christianity grew in power and influence. And we see the beginning of that animosity in today's Bible reading. It's right at the beginning of what we heard today. Kind of sneaks in. It says, when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Fear of the Jews? Why were they afraid of the Jews? Shouldn't they be afraid of the Romans? Yes, the disciples were worried that they may be next, but it was the Romans who put Jesus on that cross, not the Jews. Maybe they were afraid of a lynch mob grabbing them and finishing the job the Romans started. But the crowds were more bluster than they were action. They demanded Jesus be killed and Barabbas be released, but they didn't dirty their hands by executing Jesus themselves. In fact, they couldn't. That would have triggered Roman intervention to keep the peace. The Romans kept order and they executed the legal justice. The crowds did not. So what were the disciples afraid of? I'm not sure. But I know what John, the writer of the gospel, was afraid of. He was angry that his fellow Jews didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah, and he didn't even try to hide his bias. In fact, it's a feature of his writing that his contemporaries would have immediately recognized. In his gospel, John regularly portrays Jews as being ignorant or evil. They are never portrayed as good. They are the mobs waiting to stone the woman caught in adultery. They are the corrupt religious leaders who demand allegiance to authority rather than embracing the freedom that Jesus brought. They are the people who reject Jesus because they are too stupid to see the Messiah staring them in the face. They are the crowds who demanded Jesus' execution and let a murderer go free. Many Bible scholars believe that this was done on purpose. John was so angry that some of his fellow Jews didn't recognize Jesus the same way that he did, so he portrayed them in the most negative light possible. Some critics even go so far as to say that John's gospel is anti-Semitic. I don't think it is. I don't think he was intended that way, as John still identified as a Jew. This wasn't a case of Jewish self-hatred. But John's gospel has been used as an anti-Semitic tool. My rabbi friends have real difficulty with the Gospel of John. And I can see why. It makes Jewish people look evil and stupid, a caricature of who they were at the time and who they have been throughout history, as Jewish people bore the brunt of Christian anger for 2 millennia. Today, at sundown, our Jewish friends will observe Yom HaShoah, a day of remembrance for those killed in the Holocaust. Inaugurated in 1953 by Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, they did so they could come to remember as a people what happened in those years. And at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning in Israel, a siren will blow. The country will stop. Cars will stop driving. Trains will remain still. People will stop whatever they're doing, and the whole country will observe 2 minutes of solemn silence to remember those who perished in Nazi death camps. Many Jewish people reject the word Holocaust to name the event. Holocaust means burnt offering. They say they may have been burnt, but they did not offer anything. It was taken from them. They would use the word Shoah, which means catastrophe, calamity. They see the Shoah as the logical consequence of anti-Semitic aggression of many Christians throughout history. Many Christians were open about their hatred of Jewish people. Our own Martin Luther wrote some scathingly hateful articles against Jews, many of which were used by some theologians and preachers to justify anti-Jewish laws and practices, which led to Christian complicity in the Shoah. Of course, many Christians fought against anti-Jewish laws of their countries, rejecting the anti-Jewish interpretations of the Bible, but we can't ignore the consequences of our theology and history. That's why 25 years ago, the Lutheran World Federation issued an apology to the Jewish community for the role of Luther's anti-Jewish writing, which played in Jewish persecution and genocide, denouncing those writings as anti-gospel and anti-Christ. Looking back at our history with honest reflection doesn't mean that we should wallow in guilt for the past transgressions of Christians. What it does mean, however, is that we should be aware of them. We should know our history. We should learn from our history, both good and bad, and see and speak when we see the worst impulses of our history repeating itself, when Christians and others use religion or ideology to persecute or hurt others. I never argue with atheists, but I listen to them. I listen to the pain that is often underlying their anger at religion. Because religion becomes toxic when it demands a place of power rather than servanthood. Religion becomes toxic when it believes itself superior to others. Religion becomes toxic when it places demands on those who don't confess the same belief. And today's gospel shows us how to respond to those who are angry with what we believe. Thomas was angry. Saying that Jesus was alive was offensive to both his reasoned sensibilities and the death he just witnessed. Don't tell me Jesus is alive, is like he's saying. That's just not helpful. Thomas has been called the patron saint of atheists because he asks the right questions and he makes legitimate demands. But see how the disciples respond to him when he won't allow the silliness of dead people rising interfere with the hard work of grieving. Instead of telling Thomas that he was stupid for not believing, they just allowed Jesus to speak into his life. So when Jesus stood among them and showed him the wounds that caused his death, Thomas didn't need convincing. He saw with his own eyes and felt with his own hands the presence of the risen Jesus. And so Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. That's the essence of faith, isn't it? Not seeing and yet believing. I know that's true for me. I don't believe in the God revealed in Jesus because I've seen him with my own eyes, but I have felt the love given to me, and I've seen with the eyes of faith. I don't believe in the God revealed in Jesus because I've been reasoned into the faith by strong arguments and by rational, well-structured debate, but because I have been grabbed by the testimony of others and haven't been able to let go. I don't believe in the God revealed in Jesus because I have physically touched the wounds of the risen Jesus, but because I have been touched by the power of his story and the strength of his witnesses. And I have been brought into that story so that I can bear witness to what I have received: forgiveness and love by the God who is forgiving and loving. So how about you? How has God met you? Do you not see and yet you believe? Do you see with the eyes of faith because you have felt the power of God's love? Or are you still waiting? Are you still waiting for the risen Christ to appear in your life? Are you wanting to put your hands in them, in those wounds, the wounds that tell you that he died for you? If so, let Thomas be your guide. Doubt and skepticism are healthy. They keep us honest. So keep searching. Keep asking good questions. Listen to the life around you. Look for signs of resurrection behind locked doors. And prepare to be surprised by what you encounter. And maybe you will hear the words of the risen Jesus: "Peace be with you." And may this be so among us. Amen.